Welcome to the second day of the conference, Why Queer History Matters. It's wonderful to see everyone back here today, bright and early, ready to continue on the important conversations that were started yesterday, which have already covered a broad range of topics, ranging from how we can create and use queer archives in order to counteract the erasure of LGBTIQ+ people from national and transnational histories, to how historical discourses on sexual and gender minorities are used and abused in contemporary debates today. My name is Andrea Grønningsæter, and I will be chairing the first part of today's program up until lunch. I am a PhD candidate at the law faculty here in Bergen, and my research primarily focuses on the right to refugee status on the basis of sexual orientation. Now, as someone trained in law, a discipline that has traditionally focused quite narrowly on formal rights and regulations, I am very excited to hear today's excellent speakers share their thoughts and perspectives on how and why queer history matters. At the same time, as the chair, I also have the duty to make sure that we get through today's program in a somewhat orderly and timely fashion. So like yesterday, I will just make a note that today we will be using a conventional concept of time, and I will be trying to make sure that everyone keeps within the time limits. If there is any time left after the sessions of each speakers, we will open up for Q&As. For the audience, they can then come up to the microphone, and if there are anyone who has questions online, we will be able to take those questions as well. So please make note of any issues, topics, or notions that you would like to ask the speakers to reflect or comment upon when they finish. So as mentioned in the opening yesterday, this conference is organized as a part of the Queer Culture Year, which marks the 50th anniversary of the decriminalization of homosexuality in Norway. Or more specifically, the repeal of Section 213 in the Norwegian Penal Code, which prohibited sexual acts between men. Now, if I were to use law as a lens, it would be easy to frame the development that followed as a history of progress, whereby rights and protections of LGBTQ+ people have consistently been expanded over time, from the inclusion in anti-discrimination legislation to the implementation of a gender-neutral marriage act, and now finally the recognition of trans people's right to change their legal gender status based on self-determination without a requirement of medical diagnosis or irreversible sterilization. However, while important legal battles have been won in recent years, both in Norway and in many other countries across the world, the debate concerning sexual minorities and gender minorities has simultaneously become more polarized and aggressive in recent years. As a part of this process, the human rights of queer and trans people are increasingly being drawn into political culture wars playing out on a global scale. And in the days leading up to this year's Pride celebrations in Oslo, which culminated in the shooting at London pub, several articles were published both in the conventional media and on social media, arguing that the queer movement has gone too far in pushing their pride ideology on the rest of society. In such debate, trans people are often placed in a particularly vulnerable situation, accused both of undermining traditional family values or biological scientific facts, and as posing a threat to the safety and rights of majority cis women. This raises the question of what we can learn from historical perspectives on gender diversity and identities in different locations and contexts. To help us address some of these complex issues, we are very lucky today to have with us a number of distinguished speakers who will share their work and insights with us today. And I am very honored to introduce the very first speakers today, Jayna Kothari, who will present the paper Queer Archives and Activism in India. Kothari is the executive director and co-founder of the Center for Law and Policy Research located in Bangalore. Her research practice and interests cover a broad range of topics, including constitutional law, gender and sexuality law, disability rights, and discrimination law. And as a trained lawyer and senior advocate, she has argued before the Indian Supreme Court on several occasions, including in the challenges against Section 377, which led to a landmark judgment in 2018, where homosexuality was decriminalized. Kothari has published extensively on the rights of transgendered people in India, including the need to recognize gender identity as a core aspect of a person's self that should be subject to self-determination. Please help me welcome Kothari to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and I'm really honored to be here and to be with all of you at this conference with such amazing speakers and, of course, the audience. I'm a relative newcomer, I think, to these debates, having worked on trans rights litigation for the last 7 to 8 years. And today I will speak as a lawyer and try and give you a slice of a history of trans legal activism in India. Susan Stryker's film screening last evening really, I think, laid the ground to what and how the trans movement in India has been shaped. It was really, the similarities were striking. One of the earliest documented cases that went to court in India was Queen Empress versus Khairati in 1884, where a transgender person was arrested and prosecuted under Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code on the suspicion that Khairati was a habitual sodomite. The sessions judge stated as follows in the case, and I quote, "This case relates to a person named Khairati, over whom the police seem to have exercised some sort of supervision, whether strictly regular or not, as a eunuch. The man is not a eunuch in the literal sense, but he was called for by the police when, on a visit to his village, he was found singing dressed as a woman among the women of a certain family. Having been subjected to examination by the civil surgeon, he is shown to have the characteristic mark of a habitual catamite, the distortion of the orifice of the anus into the shape of a trumpet, and also to be affected by syphilis in the same region in a manner which distinctly points to unnatural intercourse within the last few months." Khairati was later acquitted, and the court held that the charge upon, and again I quote, "the charge upon which the accused was committed and subsequently tried alleges neither time when, place where, nor point to any known or unknown person with whom the particular act charged as an offense under Section 377 of the Penal Code was committed." Khairati's story has been the story of how Section 377 and the criminal law has been used against trans persons. Transgender persons have been particularly the subject of violence and harassment at the hands of the police, and their criminalization began with their inclusion under the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, a colonial legislation that, along with many castes and tribes, included a special section on transgender and intersex persons who were at that time termed as eunuchs. This is a slide of an extract of the Criminal Tribes Act. There was a special section where trans persons were named derogatively as eunuchs, and some of the offenses or some of the powers of the police were that they could maintain a register of the names and residence of trans persons who were reasonably suspected of kidnapping or castrating children. The Criminal Tribes Act was ultimately repealed. However, remnants of this colonial legislation continued in many state-specific legislations in India. One of these was the Telangana Eunuchs Act. It says the date is 1329 Farsi, which translates to about 1919. And if you see, this is a long legislation and I've just extracted a portion of it, but Section 2, you can see, is so similar to the Criminal Tribes Act, where it again empowers the police and the government to keep a register of the names and residences of transgender persons who are suspected of kidnapping or castrating children. And there are other parts of this legislation which criminalize and allow the police to arrest without warrant any person found dressed up as a woman and performing in public places, performing or singing in public places. Early legal activism around LGBTQ rights started in India with a movement against Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which was also a colonial-era legislation. And this is what Section 377 is. It defines unnatural offenses. Whoever voluntarily has carnal intercourse against the order of nature with any man, woman, or animal shall be punished with imprisonment for life or with imprisonment of either description, which may extend up to 10 years. The activism against Section 377 started only in the 90s in India in the backdrop of HIV/AIDS-related work, when health workers and activists were arrested and harassed by the police in different parts of the country. Like Khairati, while people were not ultimately convicted under Section 377, it was used as a weapon to harass and arrest people. One of the first petitions challenging the constitutionality of Section 377 was in 1994 by the ABVA, or the AIDS Bhedbhav Virodhi Andolan, which is basically anti-discrimination against, the movement against anti-discrimination for HIV. This petition challenged the constitutionality of Section 377 in 1994 and sought for it to be removed from the statute books. After this was filed, this petition stayed in cold storage in the court for many years and was later closed. This was followed by a petition filed by another organization called the NAZ Foundation in 2001, again under the HIV/AIDS umbrella, but this time this petition only sought for Section 377 to be read down to exempt sex between consenting adults. This petition was led primarily by gay rights groups, despite the fact that the trans community was an integral part of the movement and was really at the receiving end of police violence. The NAZ Foundation challenge took many twists and turns and ultimately led to a very progressive judgment in 2009, where the Delhi High Court read down Section 377 and decriminalized sex between two consenting adults. This case, however, took a unique turn after the Delhi High Court judgment, in which Suresh Kaushal, a complete stranger to the litigation, a Hindu conservative, along with other religious groups such as the All India Muslim Personal Law Board and a few Christian religious groups, challenged the Delhi High Court judgment in the Supreme Court. So it was not the state who challenged it. The government accepted the decision, but there were these outside right-wing religious groups and people who challenged it. The Supreme Court in 2013 surprisingly overturned the verdict and held that it was only the parliament which could repeal the legislation. And Justice Singhvi in 2013 held, and I quote, "While reading down Section 377 of the IPC, the division bench of the High Court overlooked that a minuscule fraction of the country's population constitute lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgenders, and in the last more than 150 years, less than 200 persons have been prosecuted for committing the offense under Section 377 of the IPC. And this cannot be made a sound basis for declaring that the section is ultra-vires the provisions of Article 14, 15, and 21. So the court held that there was a minuscule minority, and just for 200 persons, the section cannot be held to be violative of constitutional rights. It was during this time, while this litigation was going on, that Pandyanamma, a young trans person in Chennai, around this time, self-immolated herself in a police station when she was assaulted, harassed, and threatened by the police repeatedly and was unable to take any more violence. The Madras High Court for the first time documented this violence and granted compensation to her family and directed disciplinary action against the police officers. Then in 2014 came the Nalsa decision. This was a petition filed by the National Legal Services Authority in the Supreme Court, NALSA, seeking legal recognition for transgender persons. The court, in a dramatic decision, which really changed the legal landscape, held that under the Constitution, one can self-determine one's gender identity as male, female, or transgender without the need for any medical reassignment. And it further held, I quote, Constitution makers, it can be gathered, this is from the judgment, it can be gathered, gave emphasis to the fundamental right against sex discrimination so as to prevent the direct or indirect attitude to treat people differently for the reason of not being in conformity with stereotypical generalizations of binary genders. Both gender and biological attributes constitute distinct components of sex. Biological characteristics, of course, include genitals, chromosomes, and secondary sexual features, but gender attributes include one's self-image, the deep psychological or emotional sense of sexual identity and character. The discrimination on the grounds of sex under Articles 15 and 16 therefore includes discrimination on the grounds of gender identity. While this judgment, and it goes on to say that gender, as already indicated, constitutes the core of one's sense of being as well as an integral part of a person's identity. Legal recognition of gender identity is therefore part of the right to dignity and freedom guaranteed under our Constitution. While this judgment does have certain concerns in providing for a third gender, in many places it talks about a third gender, it upholds gender self-determination. And for the first time, the expansion of sex under the Constitution was made to include gender identity and sexual orientation. The NALSA decision gave an impetus to the trans community in India to organize rapidly and mobilize further legal action for decriminalization. And these attempts started with first to a challenge to the Telangana Eunuchs Act, which I showed earlier. And we challenged this in the High Court at Hyderabad, and the court passed an interim order restraining the operation of the law. So right now the law has been suspended. A similar legislation in Karnataka, Section 36A of the Karnataka Police Act, was also challenged by us in 2016, and this was amended. This was amended by the government, and if you read it, it's very similar to the Criminal Tribes Act, that it talks about a preparation and maintenance of a register of the names and residences of all persons. If you see the word persons is in brackets, it used to be eunuchs. And after the litigation, if you see the footnote, it was amended to be persons. The government refused to delete the section, but said we will replace the word with persons. These two challenges, very much like the Compton's cafeteria riot that we saw in the film yesterday, were the first wins of the legal battles for decriminalization prior to the big Section 377 case. Then in 2017, we had another big Supreme Court decision, which was on recognition of privacy as a fundamental right. This was a decision completely unconnected to gender identity and sexual orientation. It was whether privacy is a fundamental right. And the court held that, yes, privacy is a fundamental right under the Constitution in India, and the court went into referring to the 2013 judgment and said that a minuscule fraction of the country's population, it quoted constitutes lesbians, gays, bisexual, or transgender, as observed by the judgment of this court, is not a sustainable basis to deny the right to privacy. Discrete and insular minorities face grave dangers of discrimination for the simple reason that their views, beliefs, or ways of life does not accord with the mainstream. Yet, in a democratic constitution founded on the rule of law, their rights are as sacred as those conferred on other citizens to protect their freedoms and liberties. So it was after the privacy judgment that the big Naftage decision came. Following the NALSA and the privacy decision, many new petitions were filed in the Supreme Court to raise the challenge against Section 377 afresh. One of them was filed by 3 trans activists, Akkai, Sana, and Umi from Bangalore, and along with a team of small lawyers, we represented them in this litigation. As I was speaking to Swati over the last few days discussing this litigation, while the Supreme Court was filled with members of the queer community, the lawyers, the media, and all the petitioners from the other cases who were well-known gay and lesbian figures in India, Akkai and Sana, who had traveled from Bangalore to Delhi to be in the Supreme Court and to witness the hearing, were stopped at the entrance despite having their passes. It was only after substantial effort and explanations that they were let in and we could manage to get them inside the court. The litigation showed the dramatic caste, class, and gender divide, even in this unanimous fight against Section 377. These were the judges, the 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court that gave the decision. We had one woman judge, and the court held that Justice Chandrachud, that the court read down Section 377 and held that sexual and gender-based minorities cannot live in fear if the Constitution has to have meaning for them on even terms. In its quest for equality and the equal protection of the law, the Constitution guarantees to them an equal citizenship. In decriminalizing such conduct, the values of the Constitution assure to the LGBT community the ability to lead a life of freedom from fear and to find fulfillment in intimate choices. One of the judges even held and directed that the Union of India should take all measures to ensure that this judgment is given wide publicity through the public media, which includes television, radio, print, and online media, and also directed particularly that police officials should be given periodic sensitization and awareness training. Of course, none of this has happened, even 4 years after the judgment. So what has happened post-Navtej? The BJP government, the Hindu right government, in a tearing hurry, passed the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act in 2019. And even more horrifying was that the rules for the operationalization of this law were passed in August 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic and the lockdowns, knowing fully well that civil society cannot respond and organize against this legislation. There has been serious opposition to this law, and even this act has been challenged. Why has it been challenged? While it provides legal recognition to one's gender identity, it only provides self-determination for obtaining a certificate as transgender. But for persons who want their gender identity as male or female, the Act requires medical certification. It also provides a much lower punishment for sexual assault than the regular criminal law, which provides a much higher punishment for rape, and rape is only against women under the penal code. It's not gender neutral. This is Grace Banu, a very, very well-known Dalit rights activist in India, and who has really been, pioneering the activism against the Transgender Persons Act. So while these battles are ongoing, transgender activists and ordinary trans persons, students, couples, individuals, have been litigating all over India for matters relating to their everyday lives. Getting name and gender markers changed in their legal documents, quashing police complaints filed against them, getting access to government employment, with Karnataka being the first state to provide 1% reservation in public employment, and getting married. The Madras High Court has recently held that where a trans woman identified herself as a woman, the marriage registrar could not refuse marriage registration. And so there are still many current demands and struggles for trans activism. We're still fighting reservations and affirmative action. We're still fighting for recognition of gender identity based on self-identification. There's a big demand for reform in criminal law for sexual assault and rape to be gender neutral. And more than anything, really a demand for a positive civil law on equality. There are cases of same-sex marriage filed in the Delhi High Court as well. And there is recently a queer archive called Kamra, based in the National Law School in Bangalore, which stands for Queer Archive for Memory, Reflection, and Activism, which has tried to archive some of these, the legal battles. But while these demands while some of these demands that I've outlined may take many years and even decades to realize, trans rights litigation has succeeded in challenging gender, class, and caste hierarchies, and really in reimagining the understanding of equality in India. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful insight into how queer communities and trans communities have organized in order to challenge discriminatory laws, Jayna. We will see at the end of the session if we have time for Q&A, so if there was anything that you wanted to ask Jayna during her presentation, please make a note of it, and we'll make sure that at some point you'll be able to ask it. Our next speaker will join us online from India. Akkai Padmashali is an activist working for the rights of trans people in India. She is the founder of the organization Unwanted, an LGBT rights group, which, among other things, has contributed in the fight to overturn the colonial era ban on same-sex sexual relations in Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. Through her activism, Padmashali has worked for the legal recognition of trans people's fundamental civil rights, including the right to self-identify as male, female, or a third gender, as well as the right for privacy for vulnerable groups such as sex workers and people who are forced to beg on the streets. She has worked internationally for trans people's rights. In 2017, she was invited to meet the former US President Barack Obama when he visited India, and we are very happy, even though she cannot be with us physically today, that we are able to hear her from India on the screen. So please help me give a warm welcome to Akkai.
I think you're muted.
No.
That's why I withdrew my visit to Norway, Bergen. I feel so privileged, I feel so honored, I feel so happy to interact with all the human beings across the globe. I think, as I keep saying, that human beings first and everything next. My name is Akkai Padmashali. I am a male to female transgender woman. I identify myself as a woman, and I'm the founder of an organization called Ondede. It is a Kannada word for convergence, where we speak about dignity, voice, sexuality of the gender non-conforming children, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, Jogappa, Marladi, Shivshakti, Jokta, Akwa, Nirvan, and many other identities, including the female to male transgender man, transgender woman, and the intersex communities. When we say about dignity, voice, and sexuality, I think my organization, including myself, coming from a working class, non-English speaking background in Bangalore, Karnataka, the southern part of India, and you all know that India is such a huge nation, crossing 1.3 billion of the population of the largest democracy I represent here. I think my community voices are being constantly ignored for several centuries and decades very later. I feel so happy to speak for two things. One, because the Supreme Court of India's recognition on gender identity and sexual orientation. Number two, I think in the introduction, I also really want to correct that Akkai is not only a transgender rights activist or not only working for the rights of transgender people. I think I am a social and political activist. I speak for the rights of women, children, youth, the Dalit means who are being constantly discriminated on the grounds of caste that we are living in the country. And being part of the movement of the larger movement like women's movement, the Dalit movement, the religious minorities movement, the class and caste and other minorities movement, the social justice movement, the human rights defenders movement, I think being part of such movements since 30 years, educating and wanting to break the barrier about gender and sexuality to build a consensus. And the consensus means building a movement of convergence, of getting a cross section of people together to speak with pride, and dignity for what we are today. It is not my fault to be a transgender woman. It is not my other friends to be, as lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, Jogappa, Marladi, Shiv Shakti identities. I think it is our existence. Our existence matters. Our voice matters. Our identity matters. Our sexuality matters. I think the issue of sexual orientation, gender identity, it's not about one country issue or one state issue. It's about the global issue. If you can really have your time and Google how Akkai has raised the issues before the former US President of America, Mr. Barack Obama. I raise the global voice of our people. We are being stigmatized. We are being constantly discriminated. We are being constantly, structurally, systematically oppressed by the concept of majoritarianism. What is the concept of majoritarianism? Anything that is being seen from the context or the lens of a cis man, cis women, undermining our identities or sexualities, it is highly not compromisable. I think the concept of majoritarianism is very relevant to the patriarchy and power. The concept of majoritarianism is something called the totalitarianism. I think being part of the largest democracy, it's kindly and not acceptable at all. I think till the last breath of my life, I think we shall need to fight to uphold our rights. I think I should thank the Supreme Court of India for recognizing our issue because in India, there were political structures, there were political systems, there is a caste based, there is a religious based, very much rich in its culture of protecting their own sake of issues. But the Indian judiciary has really stood with the movement of sexual minorities. Indian judiciary has supported the demands of sexual minorities. Since 30 years, I think, be it any political parties, be it any government, who were in power, who did not spoke a single word except the Indian National Congress. I think in that context of this agenda, today we are just asking and demanding the governments to implement the 2014 verdict, which was recognized transgender community are equal citizens before the Constitution of India. I remember the Section 37 discipline, I think my colleague Jayna, who has clearly mentioned from 1860s to 2009, India was in such a like criminalized cage that we were criminals before the Indian Constitution. And from 2009, I think the Honorable Delhi High Court verdict said consensual sex between adults in privacy is not punishable, though the judgment spoke about constitutional morality and we were made decriminals before the Constitution. In 2013, again, we were made recriminals before the Constitution of India. And in 2018, the Honorable Supreme Court's Constitution bench said, we are no more criminals. Now, the simple question for me, it is not only the question of India, I think across the globe, we as community are facing the system of discrimination, stigma, and the phobia of practicing, be it the transphobia, homophobia, biphobia, Islamophobia, and many other phobias have been practiced by the so-called majoritarians. Now, the question is very simple. How can a system in the largest democracy can play a concept of, criminals to decriminals to recriminals and no more criminals? So now, who has the power to decide my identity? Who has the power to decide my sexuality? Who has the power to decide my life? Who has the power to decide my existence? I think including any of the state authority to the common person have no right to decide my identity, and I will decide my identity. I will decide my sexuality. The only business of society and the state needs to accept what a demand that should be part of the state language, that I think be there any sort of acts or policies or any sort of amendment that needs to happen. I think their community voices is utmost. Yes, I come from a very working class non-English speaking background, sexual minority community in Bangalore, mobilizing, collectivizing, and educating our people about how do we accept self? How do we fight against the larger notion, which is so much of phobia existing in the largest world that we all are living today? I think I had been to several countries, including Japan, the United States of America, be it Southern Asian countries. I really found we as sexual minorities are being discriminated, on the grounds of blacks and white. If you're black and if you are black LGBTIQ, you are facing double times of the discrimination. If you are in India, if you are Dalit, if you are so-called LGBTIQ++, you are facing double times than the discrimination. So how do we combat this? I think there is a need, and be it the United Nations Human Rights Council, India still we have not voted in favor of, the sexual minority community before United Nations Human Rights Council, and the question still lies why India took an abstinence stand. Why India took a neutral stand. I know several countries have took that neutral stand, and many countries have expressed that they're not going to vote before the United Nations Human Rights Council. I think this is shame on the respective countries, on the respective leaders of the rulers of such nation. It is shame the 21st century is not supporting gender identity. 21st century is not supporting sexual orientation. I think it is nothing that we are not here to be as an antisocial elements, but we want to say we belong to certain nation, we belong to certain communities, and we are proud to be part of such nation and such communities. And in the process of that, I think the world needs an appropriate political participation. The world needs our issue to be discussed and debated. I remember Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela is a black man who was a former president of South African country who struggled for himself and who struggled for the lives of the black communities. How did Mr. Barack Obama did? In the same juncture, I think it's an utmost crucial juncture. We as the lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, female to male transgender, male to female transgender woman, Jogappa, Marladi, Shivshakti, Jokta, it is our utmost need that we shall be occupying other social spaces to ensure to eradicate all forms of discrimination, to eradicate all forms of violence, to eradicate all forms of stigma that has been attached to this patriarchal society. With this, I want to conclude saying that judge not, support gender identity, judge not, support sexual diversity. And I'm missing you in person. I think if you ask me why queer history matters because we are human beings first and everything next. Thank you, organizers. Thank you so much. Namaskara.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Akkai for giving a really strong and uncompromising voice to the people who are affected by a lot of the discriminatory practices that we are discussing today. And I think you really summed it up very well by saying that we are human beings first and everything else second. Unfortunately, we are out of time with regards to the Q&A. However, we are lucky that both Jayna and Akkai will join us for the panel conversation later. So if you do have any questions or comments, please write them down on a piece of paper and then keep them for the panel discussion that we will have a little bit later. We will move on to the next speaker today, and I'm very honored to introduce Anzio Jacobs. Jacobs is a community activist in the LGBTQI+ community in South Africa. They have been instrumental in founding several LGBTQI+ projects in the educational section, including the organization Scope, which works to alleviate the effects of socioeconomic marginalization of queer communities. Currently, Jacobs is working with Black LGBTQI+ youth from rural and peri-urban areas that are affected by their socioeconomic status, shedding light on their narratives and working to effect change around issues of gender identity and sexual orientation. In 2019, they published a book chapter in the Queer African Handbook by Routledge on queer identities and protests. And in 2020, they finished their master dissertation on oppression as a result of assumed homogeneity in protests. Today, they will present the paper White Words and Violence, a Queer African History. Please give a warm welcome to Anzio Jacobs.
It's a wonderful opportunity to present to you today. I'd like to start by thanking Tuna, Sturla, Bjorn, Greta, and Siri for inviting me to the Bergen exchanges, which resulted in my presence here today, I imagine. And also to Matt, who helped with tech. I'm sorry for putting you through such grief. Next time, maybe invite me for longer so that I can attend to extramural activities. I spent a lot of time trying to rework this paper so that it would be appropriate for this audience. I hope this work and that to come in the continuing pursuit of queer archive in Norway in some way aids the ability of those to come, to dream in the tongues of their people. This paper, titled White Words and Violence, a Queer African History, I'd like to start off with the vignette. I'm okay. I have not died. I'm okay. I have not died. I'm okay. I have not died. This paper begins with a refrain from a poet, Vuyela Maluleke, and it is one of hope in the context of femicide and raising hate crimes in the South African context currently. That history matters presupposes a universal conception of history, which this paper problematizes and challenges through what it terms white words to evoke colonial conquest, settler colonialism, imperialism, and the concomitant violence. The paper cites the work of Manelensen to contemplate the stuff of archive as it relates to queer life. It considers the erasure consequential of settler colonialism and denialism, as written by Stanley, and how African women retrieve archives and collective memories in the Pan-African imaginary, as written by Sanya and Lutomia. In order to develop the conceptualization of epistemic violence, the paper relies on Claudia Brunner, whose paper holds the same title. Brunner does a broad sweep in what she describes as an interdisciplinary assemblage of the conceptualization of epistemic violence. Her work focuses on international relations, and her analysis aids in the articulation of the peculiarity of the provocation of this conference, why queer history matters. The assemblage is helpful as it navigates the work of authors in diverse critical fields of knowledge production, all interested in understanding epistemic violence as a lens through which we can observe the role of the academy, and indeed ourselves in the perpetuation of violence, as we write and contribute and are implicated in it. As knowledge and discourse are formed within epistemes, this paper begins to question those. It ponders fact, legend, and present-day praxis to navigate the existences and experiences of African identities beyond Western conceptions of gender and sexuality, though I am at a loss for what to replace those with. The way we see and understand history is warped, as it favors the powerful and excludes the powerless. But in so doing, it perpetuates and reinforces those power dynamics in present and future. I say this particularly as that history pertains to the archives, much of which inform the history of the African continent and through the continued subjugation of women and queer people in many parts of Africa. I must begin this by saying that I'm not an academic, though I'm delighted to know that an academic perspective from the continent will be delivered by my learned colleague, Professor Sylvia Tamale, who I couldn't greet because I was starstruck yesterday. I hope to do a few things in this presentation. The first is to give some credence to what I understand to be epistemicide on the African continent. The second, to depart even superficially from the term queer, as I do not have a replacement for it and understand its numerous connotations and effects. Third, I would like to contemplate what I call white words in relation to the colonial period and the associated violences that came with it. To draw attention to the possibilities of alternative repositories and knowledge production that are not kept as part of historical accounts of African experiences of sexuality and identity. And finally, to link that epistemicide to the ongoing erasure and subjugation of queer people and women on the continent through sharing some recent instances where such subjugation and degradation persists as a result of the continued onslaught of what I call white words. Epistemicide, simply put, is the destruction of existing knowledge. For Foucault, epistemes are implicit rules of formation which govern what constitutes legitimate forms of knowledge for a particular cultural period. Spivak uses Foucault's work as a point of departure, and this paper relies on her definition, where she offers that the clearest available example of such epistemic violence is the remotely orchestrated, far-flung, and heterogeneous project to constitute the colonial subject as other. While the other has served many purposes in feminist writings, it is deployed to trace the colonial subject in Africa here. This paper relies on Spivak's subaltern. I suppose I should move a slide. I forgot about those. It is not that everything they read, critical or uncritical, is caught within the debate of the production of that other, supporting or critiquing the constitution of the subject as Europe. Intellectuals forget at their peril that this entire overdetermined enterprise was in the interest of a dynamic economic situation requiring that interests, motives, desires, and power of knowledge be ruthlessly dislocated. The erasure of black women in the African history is inextricably linked to the advent of capitalism in Europe. The creation of gender in African imaginary, outside of what it was in pre-colonial times, this paper argues, resulted in consequence of black queer people and their existence within African societies being erased too. I considered the work of Silvia Frederici and her inquest into the advent of capitalism, linking women's subjugation to the desire for control over reproduction of labor. In Caliban and the Witch, Frederici investigates the capitalist rationalization of social reproduction. She enables a feminist understanding of the origins of anti-feminist praxis located in capitalist Europe. Beginning here in a thorough investigation of the witch's creation and the subsequent perpetuation, Frederici offers a lens through which we can investigate the undoing of women in the African context in the colonial era. She quotes Marx in her work and describes primitive accumulation, where she says such accumulation was not simply the accumulation and concentration of exploitable workers and capital. The accumulation instead of differences and divisions within the working class, the forming of hierarchies built on gender, and the fictive concepts of race and age became the class rule underpinning the modern proletariat. The body was required to transform into a work machine to expropriate European workers from their subsistence and enslaved natives. Such expropriation resulted in a degradation of women for the reproduction of the workforce. This was only possible by destroying women's power and extenuating the witch. The victor has written and archived our history. Because of this, to interrogate the archival history of queer people and their existence on the African continent, indeed the validity of history, I'm persuaded by Matsuda, who asks the other question. I quote, "The way I try to understand the interconnection of all forms of subordination is through a method I call, ask the other question. When I see something that looks racist, I ask, where's the patriarchy in this? When I see something that looks sexist, I ask, where's the heterosexism in this? When I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where is the class interest in this?" This begins the work of unearthing the archive of black women in the African continent, the history of her people spanning centuries, the history that is poorly kept. This was no mistake. The prevalence and presence of the colonial imagination mars the history of great queens and kings of Africa, and by extension, the history of her people. That imagination informs how stories are now told. That history, white words, denotes missionary documents that make their way to the West, detailing, as early anthropologists account, the existence of my people. The term further denotes the deployment of religious dogma by missionaries and the resulting erasure of traditions, values, customs, and culture. I have not forgotten the role of Islam, but that's an entirely different presentation, and I believe that everyone alluded to it yesterday. Those white words become the victor in our historical accounts of Africans. White words infer a period and praxis of interruption and insertion of Western norms and values, and the erasure of inconvenient realities incongruent with the project of the West. Booker writes in an introduction of women, colonial resistance, and decolonization after attending a conference challenging on African histories, that the mainstreaming of feminist curiosity would not only highlight the political impacts of privileged masculinity and suppressed femininity, but would also give valuable insights into the relationships between patriarchy in Africa, imperialism, racism, and colonialism. The notion of collective memory can be understood as the continuous construction of memories through shared cultural images, stories, and conceptions of the past. In questioning the ways in which historians conceptualize events in national histories, the connections between memories of individuals and the social collective still remain relevant and enlightening. While archives and collective memories are not the same, they are certainly connected. Claudia Brunner draws on the writing of critical geographers Kof and MacDonald and sociolinguist Pinto to navigate the human experience of struggle within asymmetric power relations in the post-colonial present. In doing so, she draws our attention to the problem of understanding the archive as a particular repository form. Kof is attentive to the expert imaginaries, naturalizing truth claims of geographies and often colonial discourse while producing that knowledge from afar. MacDonald offers an analysis of epistemic violence in the material and cognitive gap, focusing on the other, who he argues not only relies on but perpetuates social, material, economic, and epistemic asymmetries based on race and class. I suggest this is the position of the missionary or the academic or archivist in the location, as I mentioned earlier, that can authoritatively account for a reality which is captured in what Lanson, I keep getting his surname wrong, describes as vexed relationships between objects, bodies, narratives, and desires, as the quotidian becomes the fuel for animating capacious engagements with impossible subjects of history. For Oyewumi, who writes across the 90s into the 2000s, and in fact, currently really famous, really cool, the colonial imposition in Yoruba society led to the fundamental distortion of all areas of life. She evidences the disruption of social order in the making of women in colonial accounts of the Yoruba people, and in so doing causes one of the many fissures in Western knowledge production related to African realities. I removed quotes of Professor Tamale, as I would hate to misinterpret or misquote her work that informs a significant amount of my own thinking. However, thinking through the decolonial practice and Afrofeminism, she writes, of course, poorly summarized here, the main focus of decolonization and Afrofeminism is unlearning imperial power relations by relearning to shake off the colonial filters through which we view the world, including the instruments of law, education, religion, family, and sexuality. Tuck and Young write, settler colonialism is the total appropriation of indigenous life and land, rather than the selective extraction of profit-producing resources. This distinction is necessary to acknowledge the ways in which settler colonialism functions differently from other forms of colonialism. Settler colonialism requires the removal of indigenous peoples to settle on the land and establish settler sovereignty. Further, settler sovereignty and violence of removal is reasserted in each day of the occupation. The colonialists attempted to project their gender roles on a different society as a means of control so that they possessed the ability to westernize the land without opposition. As a result of their lack of tact in invading the land and economy produced tension between women and their subsequent policies, as women's roots were more deeply entrenched in society than Europeans anticipated in Africa. When the women defied the colonialists for their interference, the colonialists attempted to frustrate the opposition by redefining their role in society and placing women within a sphere that adhered to European cultural norms. The economic policies the English colonizers imposed oppressed the role of women in the economy and exploited their labor. However, their fundamental misunderstanding of the extent of the women's role and their participation in society and economy served as an impetus for women's involvement in resistance movements. Women occupied a large sector of different aspects of society, from labor to the market to the home. Resistant women were punished, imprisoned, and re-educated. Such re-education taught women the appropriate role to occupy in our societies. While the original motive for the colonial policies was strictly economic, women's defiance and resistance forced a response from the colonialists and the expansion of their policies. The English projected their gender roles onto a complex society to transform the economic structure into a growing capitalist economy. This is not removed from Frederici's explanation of subjugation of women in the West. There have been numerous scholars who have concerned themselves with power structures in African societies, but Farrar offers an important caveat in this discussion. It is quite conceivable that, I quote, in a given society, women who figured among the common folk, the great majority of women in any society could have been relatively powerless. In society in general and in the family organization, while royal and aristocratic women in the very same society, on the other hand, were in possession of considerable political authority, social status, and substantial power within the family structure. Africa is certainly not a monolith, nor are her people, cultures, language, praxis, and traditions. Like Farrar, I acknowledge the writing of Diop, Harris, Bachoven, Engels, Cohen, Rattray. Sorry, I tried to do your academic thing of listing everybody. Among the plethora of writers in a variety of fields who made findings about women with power in societies they had studied. A common shortcoming of this work is the application of Western epistemes through which they come to make their findings. This paper departs from Farrar and others, as he notes in the dismissal of many interesting political aberrations of the Hepzibah, Elizabeth I, and the Empress Dowager, the types that have occasionally occurred in our histories. These have been dismissed as a resurrection of old mythologies. The idea that human societies pass through an early stage of cultural evolution characterized by, among other things, matriarchy, or as a confusing of facts. The paper offers Buca's challenge to the dichotomous lens through which this history can be challenged and considers the power imbued in dichotomies which are often androcentric and hegemonic. Those views dismiss the political authority vested in women of high station, evidence of their existence, and the powers claiming their narratives are legend. It is striking that it is often the most powerful women in African histories which are struck from the record as legend. A retelling of African history is a response to the erasure and the power of erasure, physical, epistemic, and violent. The negation of identity is so easily found if African archive is recognized as it was created, in folklore, passed from generation to generation, in oral history, in art, in symbols, and in repositories that exist beyond what the West comprehends to be such. Our repositories exist in the beadwork of the Nguni, the weaving of Kenyan baskets that tell their own stories, in the sacred rituals of the Nuer, in the songs and chants that we sing across the continent, in our dances, in our statues that came before the erosion and imposition of white words, that attempted to capture the complexities of a story far too complex for the English imagination. Manele Lanson deploys mess in his funking up of queerness in the way that retains the mundane, banal, and ordinariness of queer experience and its mercurial, often intractable qualities. They reference John Law and state, instead of creating neat analytical categories and routine regularities, social researchers should look to mess and messiness as a way to more accurately and sensitively portray social interactions and institutions. We should question why African women have become impossible subjects of history. We should carefully remember that history requires facts to substantiate it, and that we are forced to rely on archives in this debate. Repositories are a space for dwelling in and a quotidian site for marginalized subjects, as well as gendered and erotic charged energies, meanings, and other bodily processes, according to Manilanson. As such, white words are violence and erasure, not only of women, but of the feminine in all its iterations. Manilanson concisely captures this, saying, "My assertion of the queer and queering as mess and messing up comes out of a critical reading of queer theory, popular culture, vernacular language, and everyday life. My use of queer and mess is not limited to bodies, objects, and desires, but also relates to processes, behaviors, and situations. Queering and messing up are activities and actions as much as queer and mess can be about status, states, positions, identities, and orientations." I'm aware that I'm now a minute over time. I really will try my best to speed up. The colonial conquest in Africa and the anthropological teleology brought to indoctrinate us have resulted in a slow and persistent erasure of African pasts, presents, and futures. To trace this, we only need to look at the messy stuff of our continent, the largest and most expansive, by the way. Societies through the Horn of Africa and the Sudanic Belt, I quote this from a book, I will really try and go through it. It's really impressive, captures a huge amount of our history, and I really don't do it justice here. The societies in the Sudanic Belt combine agriculture and pastoralism. In Ethiopia and Eritrea, long-standing accounts exist of metallurgy and weaving and an extensive market system with Christian and Islamic religions. Islamic influence is strong amongst the Bantu-speaking populations of the coastal East Africa, especially in port cities such as Mombasa and Zanzibar. Patrilineal Bantu speakers also occupy the highland savannas of Kenya, where agriculture is the most dominant subsistence pattern. I found this really interesting because they trace our existence through what we were doing on the continent. Fascinating. The Italian Paolo Ambrogetti at the beginning of the 20th century reported an age-based homosexual relations between Eritrean men and what they called the diavoletti, little devils. A few years later, Frederick Bieber described what he termed Uranism among the Islamic Harari, Semitic-speaking agriculturalists near the Ethiopian city of Harar. In the 1950s, Simon Messing encountered males with alternative gender identities among the nearby Coptic Amhara peasants. They conducted field work in the mid-60s amongst the Cossack-speaking Konso, agriculturalists living in walled cities on the southern edge of Ethiopia. The Konso have 2 words for each penis and vagina and sexual intercourse, but no less than 4 for effeminate men. Among the Malay of the southern Ethiopia, Donald Durham observed a small minority of men crossed over to female roles. The Durham suggests that rather than discrete gender categories, the Malay recognize a continuous graduation of maleness from ritual kings to sub-chiefs on down. Brian McDermott's 1972 report of denials of homosexuality by the pastoralist Nuer of the Sudan, despite the presence of a gender-defined role for males that could include marriage to men, was cited in the preface. I'm going to skip over West Africa, although it's also fascinating, and just go to Southern Africa, where I'm from. Most societies in Southern Africa are based on a combination of cattle herding and cultivative grain crops. In Southeast Africa, extensive population shifts have occurred over the last 1,500 years as patrilineal Bantu pastoralists and farmers pushed southward from Congo and East Africa. States such as the Bemba in Zambia and the Tswana of South Africa absorbed the surrounding peoples. The matrilineal central Bantu belt extends across the northern part of this region. I will not read this bit. There's an interesting piece in history in the mining towns where miners took wives who were not wives. They were men that held the role of wives. And this was common practice. It was regularly spoken about, but not something frowned on. The wives would stay at the mine. They would return home to their wives and then go back to the mine and find their wives. Fascinating piece of our history. In conclusion, as this conference has alluded to, it is perhaps correct that the neglect and erasure of queer history have been characteristic of all national histories until recently. But the paper has argued that this is the result of what it terms white words from the advent of the colonial project into Africa's present. If we intend to address this erasure in contemporary societies, we also need to address the root cause of the erasure and meaningfully address it in how we write, archive, speak, and acknowledge history. The archive's repository can become more inclusive in the ways we enable the inclusion of Black queer people, despite the misnomer, if mindful of intersectional politics, especially those of race, class, caste, and other categories of otherness. I will have to leave it here because I really do not want to frustrate my colleagues any further, but I do just want to show you some of the things that I wonder if in archive could tell us more about the African people and our ways of life that are not captured in gender or sexual orientation or queerness. There are many meanings behind some of the symbols that you see here. The statue is perhaps my favorite as it has been recently returned, or so the article stated. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very insightful presentation. And I don't think any of us, at least I was not frustrated by the presentation at all, but rather was dwelling on how we should have had like an entire day for all of the speakers, I think, to do fully justice to your analysis. We have some time left for questions from the audience or from those joining us online, if there's anyone who has anything they want to ask. While you think on that, I thought I really found your account of how history can become, or is inevitably involved in larger structures of colonial knowledge production, Western knowledge production, capitalism. And you did touch on some of it, but do you have any reflections on how do we build an archive today in our research, in interpreting history? How can we relate to the ways that our current accounts are sort of unavoidably tainted or shaped by these larger structures?
The simplest answer that I can give is that we have to acknowledge power, because there's this way of kind of dismissing power as part of the problem. The global West doesn't seem to want to let go of power. Until recently, many African countries have still been paying for debt of the past. But many European countries have built their wealth on our backs. And so how do we talk about power in a way that is meaningful, such that we can retrieve the archive and write the archive without inflicting further epistemic violence?
It's a really good answer. Do we have any other questions or comments from the... Yeah, we have someone at the mic. Wonderful.
Hi, is this on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I'm Hadley Rankin. Anzio, thanks for a fascinating and incredibly rich talk. I'm wondering if you could take a second or two to elaborate a bit on those last images you showed, because if, as you're suggesting, we need to think about alternative archives and the messiness of the archives and the information that they might contain, it'd be really interesting to hear you say a little bit, and we talked about this, the first night over dinner, but if you could say a little bit more, yes, about these, thank you, and maybe especially about your favorite, the statue, but just to tell us, so, how do these form an alternative archive? What messier information might we then derive from them? Thanks.
I think in brief, sometimes we look at these artifacts or materials and we don't realize how much information they actually contain. The statue is that of a goddess. It's a Cameroonian goddess. And I wonder what it would mean if we actually start to unpack why this statue was created, when it was created, where it was created, by whom and for what purpose, and then to think about the concomitant rituals that surround the statue. Because once we start to see that, we start to see a broader picture than just an object, which had to be returned as all of the other things that are still left in Europe. But this is a piece in Cameroonian history which I believe needs to be returned to along with other African artifacts, because perhaps the work that has been done has been too surface. If we are confusing African identities and African experiences by grouping them as gender or sexual orientation or terming queer, we miss so much of the richness of African society, and this is something that I draw attention to. The second image, oh, sorry, I've numbered them horribly. The second image is the beadwork at the top. This is what is known as a Zulu love letter. The Zulu love letters were used to send messages during times of war. So women in particular, Zulu women in particular, would send the beadworks to their husband, each color, each shape representing a different part of messaging. And so these become affectionately known as Zulu love letters. I think that I was saying this, I can't say for fact, but I imagine because in South African history, we know that King Shaka of the Zulu, who's probably the most prominent person in Zulu history, King Shaka takes a lot of his instruction from Queen Nandi, his mother. Shaka never marries. Nandi relies on the advice of the Rain Queen Mujaji. Mujaji, for many years, Mujaji is now in her 43rd or 44th reign, currently existing in South Africa. For much of the reign, Mujaji took wives and not husbands. This was so that she could have more children. This was not to say that Mujaji was queer, but if you start to unpack that a little, what did it mean for the concept of gender? Then we think about Nandi. The role of Nandi is central to the role of Shaka, who then gets written about in very elaborate ways in history, and we start to forget the presence of Nandi. And then to start to think about the fact that traditional healers in many of the Southern African contexts, I don't know so much about Central and Northern Africa, but traditional healers often kind of embody a different gender ancestor. And so that passes in our societies very freely and is a central part of many African kind of rituals and culture is something that we do need to unpack a bit more, because that switching up of gender through the bringing on of ancestors, I've asked Sangomas. For me, it's really interesting that the ancestor that chooses the Sangoma is often of the opposite gender as we understand it. The baskets, I wonder about the patterns. I don't know much about the weaving. I read about it recently, and I wonder, because these weaving rituals are so elaborate, what these patterns could potentially contain. And then finally, I just brought in a very kind of well-known piece of African history, which is in the braiding of hair that helped slaves escape. And so if this could happen in the braiding of hair, where else could it happen in our history?
Wonderful. I think we have time for one last question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk, Anzio. I have a big question, and I don't expect a full answer, but maybe we can reflect together a little bit. I am wondering how, in your thinking and writing, you negotiate the very term Africa. In your talk, you inevitably had to at least distinguish between East, West, South Africa. There would be more, if there was more time, I imagine, more elaboration. And we did, tap into this a little bit in yesterday's talk as well. It's of course different from area studies, but nevertheless, these ways in which we imagine places have to do also a lot with the kinds of epistemes that you're critiquing and the naming practices and the power that inheres in them. So, but again, it's not that different from maybe some of the gender categories we continue to use, even though we know that they are also forms of being subjected. But overall, I am wondering how you negotiate the term Africa, or when you say African culture, African society, the complexities within. Thank you.
So this is a question that needs a lot more time. I grappled with this because I was like, I'm speaking as a South African who has traveled maybe to 8 or 9 countries around the continent. This is a very big thing to kind of make statements on. Again, I refer to our learned colleague, Prof. Damale, who I hope through her talks on decolonization and Afrofeminism, or at least I hope that's what's included in her talk, will be able to elaborate more. But certainly in my perspective, when we start to think about Africa, because we cannot think about Africa as monolithic, if we start to break down the concept of border, and we start to think about migration patterns, and we start to think about linguistic groups rather than thinking about geographic kind of space, I think that we may do a bit more justice to kind of identifying what is happening on the continent that is so large. We can certainly see from Bantu movement, Bantu in most instances settle in southern parts of Africa, but Bantu went quite far north and came back in these migration patterns. And so if we talk about Africa, this is the Africa that I am talking about, not the neat conceptions of South Africa, Botswana, Madagascar, all of these places, but rather thinking through the movement, the nomadic movement of many of the peoples of Africa, and what that movement meant for their identities, their realities, and their kind of interactions with one another as a singular people with plural identities rather than a monolith. I hope that in part answers.
Thank you so much for exemplarily answering a big question very concisely. If you do have any questions that you didn't get to ask Anzio now, then they will join us for the panel discussion. So hopefully we can continue some of the conversations then as well. Now turning from the African context to that of North America, our next speaker is Professor Emerita of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Arizona, Susan Stryker. Stryker is an award-winning scholar and filmmaker whose historical, theoretical, and creative works have influenced the conversation on trans people in the USA since the 1990s. She's the author of the book Transgender History, The Roots of Today's Revolution, which covers a North American transgender history from the mid-20th century up until today. Hopefully, many of you had the possibility to both hear and see her work yesterday at the screening of the documentary film Screaming Queers, The Right at Compton Cafeteria. And today she will present the paper Queer History in the USA, the development of trans history and the uses of trans history for the present. Please help me welcome Susan Stryker to the stage.
Hello, everybody. One moment. Setting my timer. So the talk that I'm doing today is drawn from like a 40-minute long presentation that I've cut down. So like I'm hoping I'm gonna get in everything that I need to get and that it will make sense to you all. So as my other colleagues have said, thank you to Tona and the rest of the organizers, to all of the staff, to the audience for being here, to all of my colleagues. It's been a really great event to participate in. So my talk today is adapted from an ongoing project of research and activism called At the Crossroads of Turk and Taylor, which situates the history of the 1966 Compton's Cafeteria riot in the longer history of the longer history of San Francisco, and explores how the legacy of that incident is being mobilized for social justice activism in the present. Listening to my colleagues present on their research yesterday and this morning, I'm struck by how broad and synthetic an overview of very large geographical areas and lengths of time they've taken on in answering the question of why queer history matters. And my talk today does exactly the opposite, in that I'm offering a very fine-grained micro-history of a single building at a single urban intersection. Crossroads are mythopoetically charged spaces where one realm of existence touches another and transformative encounters take place between those who meet there. Faust met Mephistopheles at the crossroads to wager his soul, and Robert Johnson made a deal there with the devil to learn how to play the blues. More than mere intersections, crossroads are sites at which to dream, to conjure new realities through the paths that we choose to forge or follow. Turk and Taylor streets physically intersect precisely once in San Francisco's impoverished Tenderloin neighborhood, but that singular geographical locus is simultaneously a crossroads, inviting us to witness the many unmet needs and unrealized potentials that impinge upon that singular point in space. The crossroads of Turk and Taylor challenge us to envision and to make real a future at that intersection where justice might dwell. In 1966, the corner storefront of the Highland Hotel at the northwest corner of Turk and Taylor Streets was home to Gene Compton's cafeteria. I know that many of you were able to attend the screening last night of my film, Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria. But for those of you who did not or who are joining online, briefly, in August of that year, 1966, this popular neighborhood late-night hangout and restaurant became the site of a landmark incident of collective resistance to police oppression, targeting gender-variant, sex-working young people living on the streets and in cheap housing in the district. An incident now remembered as a militant turning point in U.S. transgender history. Ironically, the building where oppressed queer people fought back against police violence 56 years ago is currently owned by Geo Group, one of the world's largest for-profit prison companies. They run 129 carceral facilities worldwide, including the property at Turk and Taylor, seen here in the lower left in this undated image in a Geo Group promotional brochure. In the building that once housed Compton's cafeteria, Geo Group now operates what they call a residential reentry facility under contract with federal and California state prison systems. An awning on the building identifies it as the 111 Taylor Street Apartments. But this belies the fact that it is actually a correctional institution whose residents remain under the authority of the penal system while they prepare for post-incarcerated life. In short, it is a private prison disguised as an apartment building. Both the collective resistance to police oppression at Compton's in 1966 and the subsequent use of the building at Turk and Taylor for a prison are rooted in the Tenderloin District's historic function as a containment zone, one enforced by policing and implicated in histories of racial segregation for marginalized populations and criminalized behaviors related to sexuality and gender expression. While my story today is about a building at the corner of Turk and Taylor Streets, my argument revolves around the concept of carceral power, derived from the work of Michel Foucault, to suggest how the spatial logic and practices of a carceral complex, surveillance, policing, criminalization, punishment, confinement, correction, discipline, extend beyond the physical walls of literal prisons as they are conventionally understood to become organizing principles and practices of governance for society as a whole. In attending to the processes through which a site of anti-carceral resistance becomes physically occupied by an incarceration facility, I document a literal manifestation of Foucault's insight regarding the extension of a diffuse carceral power into society more generally. I argue that while the techniques of carceral power change over time and result in different spatial practices of confinement and control, the underlying logic of carceral power remains the same. And to just a quick thumbnail description of that argument, what I argue in the longer version of this talk is that from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries in San Francisco, the police confined sex work to a particular district of the city where corrupt officers exploited and abused sex workers, demanding bribes and payoffs in exchange for allowing them to ply their criminalized trade, while also exercising many forms of extrajudicial violence against them. This sort of abuse is what the trans women sex workers who gathered to socialize at Compton's were revolting against. In the mid-20th century, social movements changed the way that police power operated. The anti-war and anti-imperialist movements, student movements, ethnic and racial minority movements, feminist and sexual liberation movements, all made radical demands that were co-opted into liberal police reforms in major cities that did change what some abuses of police power had been. The riot at Compton's cafeteria was one small incident in this broader shift. It did, for a time, result in lessened police harassment of trans women in the Tenderloin, but the more profound change was that the old relationship between corrupt policing and spatial segregation was broken. The police were no longer able to use the Tenderloin as their racket, but new forms of carceral power began to emerge in the context of the city's neoliberal economic transformation in the 1970s. We can see this process beginning to take root at the corner of Turk and Taylor Streets in 1972, when the old Compton's cafeteria closed, and its place was taken by Frenchie's K&T adult bookstore. Frenchie's owner, Earl Coons, purchased the entire building, including the Highland Hotel above the old Compton's cafeteria. By the early 1970s, the building that Frenchie's occupied at Turk and Taylor was in a state of increasing dereliction, due in part to deliberate practices of disinvestment and underdevelopment related to the neoliberal economic transformation of San Francisco's downtown commercial real estate market. In this new regime, the Tenderloin no longer functioned as an explicit sex work zone and trans ghetto with clearly enforced and policed geographical boundaries. Rather, its residential properties were emptied, its population displaced, its land parcels held in reserve in anticipation of future windfall profits whenever market conditions might dictate. In 1973, the Highland Hotel was one of only two remaining so-called Queens hotels where a lot of trans women lived, when it evicted 33 trans residents en masse, prompting a protest and picket line organized by the Trans Inclusive Gay Activists Alliance outside the building. It bears mentioning that a wave of suspicious fires swept the Tenderloin's many dilapidated residential hotels in the 1970s and 1980s, including one that gutted the Highland Hotel in 1978, after which it stood condemned, unrepaired, and empty for nearly a decade. The renovation of the old Highland Hotel started in 1986 when owner Earl Coons filed for bankruptcy. A low-income nonprofit housing provider, the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, tried and failed to acquire the property to convert it into affordable housing, but it was purchased by the Sun Yim Yun Trading Company, flipped for a profit, and sold to private developer Gary Rao, who renovated the structure and renamed it the 111 Taylor Street Apartments and began to offer market rate rental units on the property. 111 Taylor Street's history as an incarceration facility began not long thereafter in 1992. When the property was purchased by private prison company Eclectic Communications Incorporated, obviously a shell company, ECI continued to offer one floor of market rate apartments, but it found itself embroiled in scandal in 1993 when local journalists discovered that the company had leased another floor of the building to the San Francisco Sheriff's Department for what it called an overflow jail. in a quickly terminated contract with the city. There was no public outcry, however, when another tenant, the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, which ran a residential treatment facility there between 1992 and 2004, which served incarcerated recovering addicts preparing to re-enter post-incarcerated life. Although a seemingly benevolent and progressive social services program, the melding of psychomedical treatment with carceral control in a community setting outside the walls of a conventional prison proved to be a slippery slope. Rather than allowing progressive values to infuse the prison system and ameliorate some of its harsher realities, carceral power instead found new opportunities for extending itself into the social fabric in new ways. As historian Cyrus O'Brien notes, the United States built an enormous infrastructure of private, community-based residential treatment facilities, also known as halfway houses, in the 1960s and 1970s that offered rehabilitative and supportive social services to inmates preparing to exit prisons. There were fewer than 12 such facilities nationwide in 1960, but more than 2,000 by 1980. The Haight housing approximately 20% of the incarcerated population of the United States, which has the highest proportion of incarcerated people of any country in the world. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinics program at its 111 Taylor Street facility built on this national trend and exemplified it in microcosm. Quote, despite their treatment-focused, anti-institutional, and humane rationales, O'Brien contends, quote, community treatment initiatives matured to become part of the broader infrastructures of punishment and confinement that characterized the shift towards mass incarceration policies and practices in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Residents in such facilities are involuntarily confined and have compulsory work schedules. Their movements are monitored. Their relationships with family and friends are surveilled and intruded upon. Their personal property is subject to confiscation and their wages to garnishment. They risk reincarceration in conventional prisons if they fail to comply with treatment regimens or to report as required after an off-site work assignment. Initially promoted as a more compassionate and cost-effective alternative to prisons and often located within residential neighborhoods, halfway houses actually replicate prisons' technologies for surveillance, control, confinement, and management, and expand and legitimate the carceral state through a discourse of rehabilitation. Residential treatment facilities, in other words, are carceral institutions disguised as rehabilitative service centers that in effect create what Cyrus O'Brien called a prison in your community, which was a phrase that came from promotional materials from a private prison company. Well, enter Geo Group. The company was founded in 1984 as a fully owned subsidiary of the Wackenhut Security Services Corporation to provide a full range of private carceral services and products through contracts with state and federal governments worldwide. Geo Group became a fully independent company in 2002 and acquired the 111 Taylor Street facility in 2004. In noting that the old Compton's Cafeteria building at the corner of Turk and Taylor has become a for-profit incarceration facility and has served as such for 30 years, I want to suggest that this most recent use of the space is more than an adaptation of its historic use as housing for marginalized and spatially confined people to new arrangements of carceral power and emerging techniques of governance than it is a radical departure from the past. So I want to start closing today by suggesting that we remember the Compton's Cafeteria riot differently. This event was not merely an act of resistance by a small and isolated community of transgender people, but rather an act of resistance against a carceral power whose spear tip is police on the streets that also targets many other communities. In light of Geo Group's occupation of the building, remembering what happened at Compton's in 1966 should be part of a remembering, a putting back together of the sundered relationships between all who have a stake in resisting carceral power. With that in mind, I'd like to briefly showcase a few protest events over the past couple of years that have tried to articulate, if you will pardon the pun, an intersectional analysis of what needs to be addressed when mobilizing the legacy of queer and trans resistance at that location, which still animates what happens today at the crossroads of Turk and Taylor. First up, there was a protest event called Courthouse to Compton's, a march and rally from the federal courthouse a few blocks away to the site of the old Compton's cafeteria on June 18th, 2020. It was part of a nationwide wave of spontaneous protests sparked by the police murder of George Floyd. And that local activists rallied at the site of the old Compton's cafeteria to show up in support of Black trans lives. In particular, here is the image that I also used on my title slide of trans activist Janelle Luster raising her fist from atop the mobile stage of the protest as it approached the intersection of Turk and Taylor Street, where roughly 1,000 people had gathered in protest of racist police violence. Just a couple of other photos of some of the some of what went on at the Courthouse to Compton's protest, some of the graffiti of a construction site across the street where new luxury apartment buildings were being built, and a partial list of more than 25 local social justice organizations who came together to co-sponsor the rally in March. To commemorate the 54th anniversary of the Compton's cafeteria riot, city politician and, I should say, former RuPaul Drag Race contestant Honey Mahogany worked with the city to close down the intersection of Turk and Taylor on August 20th, August 23rd, 2020, where they assembled a crew of artists who painted a huge Black Trans Lives Matter mural on the street. A little later that year, November 14th, 2020, the Free Them All Anti-Detention Coalition marched from the corner of marched to the corner of Turk and Taylor to protest Geo Group's occupation of the 111 Taylor Street facility and draw connections between civil incarceration and immigration detention, because Geo Group runs not only a series of residential treatment facilities, but it also manages the so-called kids in cages family separation camps on the southern border of the United States with Mexico. At this event, protesters ritually defaced the building exterior with handprints of red paint. In March of 2021, the San Francisco Bay View, a nationally distributed Black liberation newspaper, organized a rally outside 111 Taylor in support of one of its editors at that time, Keith Malik Washington, who was a resident at the Geo Group facility and who was experiencing retaliation for having blown the whistle on a COVID-19 outbreak in the facility. Just a couple of other images. It's time to stop. A couple of other images. No state executions by COVID. Incarcerated lives matter. So, when people come together, not just at the intersection of Turk and Taylor, but at its mythopoetic crossroads, what visions of the future might we conjure there, one that is otherwise or better than the present? as we come together in the crossroads of our historical moments, where the world that we have inherited is in crisis and we are struggling to give birth to a better one. Coming together at the crossroads of Turk and Taylor gives us many opportunities to address the pressing needs and untapped potentials we see there. And as we mobilize and activate the history of militant trans resistance in the past, how can we use it as a light for helping imagine what could transpire at this intersection in the future? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for giving us a wonderful insight into how remembering and being aware of historical events and locations can also work as a way of contesting and fighting against oppressive structures today. That's really wonderful. As earlier, we now open for questions from the audience. If there are anyone listening online, I just want to remind you, you can also send in questions written, and we have someone here who will read them up. Is there anyone here in the audience who would like to ask Susan any questions? Okay, I'll give you some time to take in the presentation, and I just thought I would ask you. So, looking at sort of the trans debate in the U.S. today, how do you think that this type of activism can sort of work to sort of shape the contemporary discussions that we're having on trans in the U.S. today?
You know, that's a great question, and I will say that I think part of what's happening at the national level, which is happening at the national and transnational level and so many places, is that the figure of the trans person is kind of this imaginary phantasm without content that is mobilized in all of these forms of imaginary warfare in ways that have very little to do with actual trans lives. And you know, that is a very hard to emerging hegemonic set of discourses to try to intervene in. And part of what I'm doing in this work is really trying to think about where you can effectively make change, you know, and that, you know, as has been said a few times here in the past 2 days, it's like the distinction between the local and the global is an arbitrary and artificial one at some point. But it's like part of what I'm trying to do here is try to do work at a scale where you can actually tackle big global issues, but at a level where you can actually see some results of change. And so it's just to think about what could we do to get that building? You know, what coalition of political forces can we bring together? How can we interact with city government? How can we bring together, you know, anti-carceral and abolitionist discourses, sexual liberation, you know, freedom of, you know, expression movements, to actually envision something that deals with problems of, you know, housing in a really expensive real estate market, lack of social services, lack of employment opportunities, forms of policing that are still violent. It's and to think in a very concrete sense, rather than thinking about it's like we live in a growing theo-fascist, you know, backlash in the U.S. What can we do at this one place to make a difference? And so, how do the two things relate? It's you know, I don't know. I'm just I'm trying to find the place where I feel like the work that I do, I can actually see some progress, see some change, you know, something that you can actually accomplish. And I think it's really important to have hope that change can happen at a time when there's so many forces arrayed against the things that I actually think are vital to protect and support.
Yeah, that's a good, I think holding on to hope is a good ambition for all of us. We have some questions lined up here, I see.
Hi, firstly, thank you. I really loved that little sort of slice of sort of geographic history focusing on one place was amazing. I was just wondering, was that intersection a sort of known site in trans history before your film? I mean, I know that the riot itself wasn't known, but I was wondering if it really became a place of significance directly because of your research and the film.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it was at the literal physical center of the old trans sex work ghetto, and that it was Turk and Taylor in San Francisco is kind of synonymous with worst intersection in the city. It is considered like a kind of ground zero for all of the urban problems that there are. It was well known as, oh, that's the roughest block in the city. It's like, that's where you go to like have some serious like rough trade, fun in the evening. That was a hard block to go slumming in for your evenings, adventures in the San Francisco underground. So it was known in that sense, but the riot itself, it's like there was not a big, strong public memory of it, until actually I did some of the work that I did on it. But now it's like that, it's a whole other story, but 3 trans women of color worked with the city of San Francisco to establish the San Francisco Transgender District, which occupies the historical boundaries of the old sex work ghetto. And now it's a mechanism for using, I hate to use the words, but it's like heritage tourism as a way of bringing more development dollars into the neighborhood, which is a very mixed bag, but that history of the trans presence in the neighborhood and the militancy that happened there is increasingly seen as something that is a recognized part of the legacy of the neighborhood that's being used, instrumentalized by so many different competing agendas now. Everything from like real estate development to community empowerment initiatives to like radical abolitionist projects to cultural heritage tourism. So it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, I guess in ways you could never have foreseen,
That's
in
right.
2005.
You just put the story out there, and then stories have lives of their own.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Fascinating, and I can't decide if I'm more depressed by, what's happening with the carceral state, or more inspired by the ongoing resistance in response. I'll work on that. I think this follows on the last question, and it raises some interesting questions about, history and the uses of history and how we think about queer and other histories. Because one of the things that strikes me is, first, this question about how the lack of awareness about the significance of this site makes it so possible for it to become sort of, one could think of it as its antithesis, which is a site for the carceral state, rather than a site of the remembrance of revolution or revolt. And the other is a question of relative invisibilities, because we tend to think that it's queer histories which are invisible. Nobody knows about the Compton riots, no one knows about Comptons, no one knows that the intersection of Turk and Taylor is this in history. And yet it's actually, it's the carceral state that's so invisible because it looks like apartments. And so, I think sometimes some of the ways in which we think about what we're looking for and, whose history is visible and whose history is invisible, which power is visible and which power is invisible, needs re-examining. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that. It's not really a question.
I agree. Yeah. No.
Great.
No. I mean, I think the point is well taken. That there's many kinds of invisible social processes that happen all around us, and I do see some of my work as a historian and storyteller is about surfacing those stories and the ways that they interrelate to each other. And the takeaway for me on this, it's like it sort of starts as a story was like, so what happened at Turk and Taylor after the Comptons riot? It's like, it's a prison. What? How did that happen? But as I tried to answer that question, what really became clear to me is that the entire history of the city of San Francisco is predicated on a certain kind of racialized segregation practice. It's like, when San Francisco was part of Mexico until 1848, it was part of Spain before that, it was Ohlone land before that, and still. But that when the Anglo-American colonization happened in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, when gold rush happens right then, just by coincidence, people flock in from all over the Pacific Rim, and one of the very first things that happens to establish modern San Francisco is that you had white supremacist vigilance committees enforcing racial segregation on the city. Like, they created the Chinatown, they created Little Chile, there was a Jewish quarter. It's like immediately it gets mapped into racial ethnic enclaves with public space defined as white, hetero, sexist, patriarchal, able-bodied. There's a really great book by one of my colleagues, Claire Sears, called Arresting Dress, which is on the history of anti-cross-dressing legislation in San Francisco, which goes on the books in 1863. And that she makes this argument about how the regulation of dress is related to other kinds of body policing that create a white, heteronormative, able-bodied public sphere. What was I going to say about that? So anyway, so just that logic of incarceration is like, I don't think you have to think specifically about a prison building to recognize that part of the history of how public space, city space is organized in the US has to do with legacies of racial incarceration, that there are spatial practices of ghettoizing, segregating, containing, confining, predominantly racially minoritized populations, and that the ghettoization and spatialization of criminalized sexuality is always mapped onto racially minoritized, quote unquote, ghettos in the city. And like, that is the city, that is the subject, that's the history that we see happening in San Francisco's Tenderloin. And so there has always been a carceral logic to the neighborhood. It is a space of confinement for criminalized populations and neighborhoods. And so there is no contradiction between that past and what happens, that the protest at Compton's was an anti-carceral riot by people who lived in that segregated space, right? And so what happens, and this is what I'm repeating something I said in the talk, that as a result of social movements in the 60s that were contesting the way that power was operating, power shifts. Right, and so it's like you get a different spatial practice. The Tenderloin is no longer a racially segregated sex work ghetto. It's just a poor neighborhood in the city, and the way that the carceral power operates is through the commercial real estate market, and the fact that this building that was designed as a place to house poor people in the inner city, an SRO hotel, is easily adapted to other carceral uses. It's like, it's the same building form, also continuing to be a place where poor people who are criminalized are physically housed. And so the protest against that you saw happen at Compton's needs to continue in other means because the power is organized in a different way. But it is still all part of the same struggle, and it's very fascinating to me how legacies of trans resistance are now being picked up by groups who are not trans and who are sort of taking inspiration from what happened in '66 at Turk and Taylor and harnessing that to the stories of the groups that for whose liberation they are working.
Thank you so much. I really hate to interrupt this very interesting exchange, Unfortunately, we are already a little bit over time. I see that there's still people who would have liked to ask questions, so keep in mind we hopefully will also have time after the panel discussion for some questions. So, thank you, Susan.
Thanks.
Like all good conferences, we are now a little over time, but we will have a break. We will have a break until 11:05 precisely. So please be back here again then. Thank you so much. Okay, everyone, I'll remind all of our participants of the initial comment on the conventional concept of time. It is now 2 minutes past when we were starting up again. So please, everyone, find your seats. And I'm sure all of the interesting conversations can also happen during lunch, which will be in just a short while. But welcome back from the break. I hope you have all had the chance to stretch your legs and get a cup of coffee. We will now have a panel discussion with all of the participants from the first session. And leading as chair of the discussion, I have the great honor of introducing Jayna Kothari. Kothari is a research anthropologist and founding co-chair of Political Conflict, Gender and People's Rights Initiative at the Center for Race and Gender at the University of California, Berkeley. She leads the creation of the Archives on Legacies and Conflicts in South Asia, and as a cultural anthropologist, her research focuses on a broad range of issues, spanning from political conflict, gender, power and violence, Majorian nationalism, minoritization, caste oppression and racialization, religious in the public sphere and religious freedom, as well as human rights, justice and cultural survival. So I would like to invite Jayna, as well as all of the panelists, to join us up on the stage. Please give them all a warm welcome. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming.
It's okay. I can be off the screen. I'm with my screen. Yeah.
Hi, Akkai. She'll hear me eventually. Hi, I'm just honored and delighted. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm Jayna Kothari. I'm just honored and delighted to be with all of you. And it is an abundance of riches. I will try to...
I can hear you. It's okay. I can be off the screen. I can unmute myself.
It's okay. This is what life is like. So I'm going to try and keep time, which, hopefully will go well. So here's where to start, somewhere in between and fragmented from listening to you all today and yesterday and seeing Susan's film yesterday. Violence against persons and communities of minoritized sexual identities and orientations and the gender non-conforming is routinely justified in the name of tradition. I'm grateful to your formidable work, all of you, in helping us see the diverse genealogies of pathological violences that seek the erasure of queer, subaltern worlds, lives, bodies, histories, intersectionalities, and futures. In using the term queer here, we must also acknowledge old and newer homosexual, non-heteronormative identitary terms that have been and are profuse through global history, oral knowledges across time and space. A note on counter-memory. The archive, as you have talked about it, named and unnamed, but the way you talked about history and memory, the archive may be a gathering place of counter-memory, of acknowledgement, of possibility. It holds local knowledge on subaltern resistance and agency in defining justice, joy, representations, and accountability. Such an archive honors what may otherwise be marginalized, forgotten, or desecrated to the public and to history, and diminishes us all. The archive makes messy issues of intersectional concerns and alliances of gender, sexuality, race, class, caste, ability, religion, nation, indigeneity, ancestral memory, and so on. In doing so, the archive offers insight into the profound ruptures and dispossessions of history and the present that you map and have outlined, and that your work unhesitatingly, persistently calls to attention. It underscores the continuities and discontinuities of these fault lines today and provides context for shared engagement. In my work, women survivors in descent to political conflict and mass violence always ask the question, where is my story? This question reverberates then across imaginaries of justice and accountability. Such stories, they insist, must live in the present-past continuum to navigate erasure and memory, resistance and remembrance. A question to all of you that I have is, and then I want to get into particular questions of each, but a larger question, if I may pose, is what is the role of the archive and counter-memory in enabling queer self-determination today? And I'll start with Jayna, if I may start with you. And Akkai, actually. Akkai, can you hear me? Akkai, can you hear me? What can we do?
Yes, I can hear.
You can hear. Lovely. Wonderful. Hi. So this is a question to both of you, and then specific questions as well. In what ways do do you want to take the first question? Am I running on?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, hi, Akkai. Lovely to hear you. Do you want to pause and take a moment, or do you want me to get into the questions of each of you and then answer collectively? Anyone, you get to pick, otherwise I will decide.
Well, since you asked the first question, why don't we take that one first? And then...
Very briefly, if you wanted to, that would be lovely. So please start. Do you want me to repeat it?
No, I mean, I got your question. I think the role of the archives are really important. In the Indian context, the history of the queer movement has been relatively recent for the last 30 years. And I think the younger generation, the ones who are joining the movement now, may not have the archive gives them that, the history, whether it is legal activism, whether it is, the social activism, and that's what the archive enables. Because otherwise, the stories, some of these individual stories get left out. And the attempt is to build an archive that tells diverse stories. We've had stories where, like some of these specific stories that Susan spoke about, but in Bangalore, fights at the police station, individual activists who have died in protests, and some of these stories can be kept alive through archives. And how do we do that? How will it? And I think these stories will build our work for the future, and I think similarly for the legal stories as well. How did these legal campaigns, how were they built? Who were some of the early actors in, designing or devising these strategies? How did these strategies come to be built? And so I think not only will they strengthen, our understanding of the movement. But I think these will also be lessons for the future, and so I think plays a very, very important role.
Thank you. Thank you, Jayna. Susan?
I would just say I think it's important to distinguish what kind of archive you're talking about. Like the archive is, to me, is like too much because I mean the archive as a form, I think, comes from quite anciently, like the administration of empire, like cuneiform tablets, just like those are the first archival records. It was for the administration of empire and keeping up with how much grain surpluses you have. And that what we need for those of us who are subjected to forms of power that are violent towards us is to develop counter archives. But I want to ask the question of do we even want to call it an archive? I think about it more like resources for cultural survival, some of which involve sort of memory. It's not necessarily archive in the sense of paper-based documents that are produced by states for purposes of administration of territory and population. It's resources for survival, whether it's memory, whether it's assembling records that were not valued by the state, whether it's all the kinds of forms of cultural production that Anzio was talking about earlier, three-dimensional artifacts, patterns of wearing clothing or arranging hair. It's all of that is the archive that we need to reproduce our forms of life that have to exist in these antithetical structures and provide a resource for us and for those that we want to transmit our knowledge and culture to in the future.
And I think exactly the endangered archive or repository or one of counter-memory.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, I'm scribbling vigorously here. I think that the archive can serve as a roadmap. I certainly recently in the student movement in South Africa, there was a lot of talk about the women that had been written out of South African history. Akkai had referred to Nelson Mandela, who's fondly known across the world. But I think that a lot of Nelson Mandela's work could not have been done without the support of Winnie Mandela, who in many instances enabled his activism. And so if we can think of our archives, past and present, as a roadmap, we can bring into our current realities, like with the student movements, the identities of trans women, gender non-conforming people in the new history or the kind of living history that we're going through, and ensure that future generations are mindful of what has happened in times before. I think in doing this, we are able to establish ourselves and our identities within an archive, whatever form that takes. And I alluded to it last night. I think maybe when we think about archive in the ways of old, we forget that the new archive is TikTok, the new archive is Facebook, the new archive is Twitter. And so what does that mean for the way that we conceptualize archive?
Absolutely. Thank you. Akkai?
Yeah. I feel that the archive and communities, I think it is a documentation, and especially speaking from the working class, people who are in streets and the non-English speaking background, are really technology. Many people have iPhones, many people have smartphones, but many of us doesn't know how to download an app. How do we use such archives? In such cases, organizations like us, we are playing a role, a sort of bridge between this technology and communities. I think most of the time our team who work in the field to outreach, are taking that responsibility of, whatever that the organization has its documentation, and we are ensuring that we are going to disseminate this archive information. And the other thing that what you are also questioning, you're questioning about the self-determination. I think in that thing we are really building that amount of information, and what the Supreme Court of 2014 verdict has said. I think in such manner, we are closely working with the state and federal systems of government, especially with the support of NIMHANS, the neuromedical sciences, experts, because most of the time the political leaders are really immature to understand what is identity and sexuality. I think this archiving information is not only about very specific issue, I think it's such a broad. I remember Satis, they do also have an archive information across the country, what has happened since 30 years. I think now many of the working class section of our society are really not able to access to these sort of archives. I think that is challenging, I think now we are really finding out some spaces to work and how do we ensure that the working class sectors are going to access these archives to get much more information about the global perspective on gender and sexuality movement.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think from what you have all said, a thought that comes to mind is also to the capacity of these repositories to also act as a marker of memorialization, because so often that memorialization and acknowledgement was denied communities, and the repository of knowledge, and one that is mobile, one that is transnational, and in transnationalizing it, also one struggles to decolonize the archive, because colonial archives and their long history of violence, this is also therefore an intervention on that. Yes, thank you. So there's a comment to Jayna, you and Akkai, and then two specific questions. One is, in what ways does the present Hindu nationalist state and its institutions fail to halt prevailing dominant binary heteronormative gender moralities, politics, norms, and practices that enforce political, social, legal, ideological forms of violence on trans persons and communities in order to continue to criminalize such individuals?
Would Akkai like to go first?
Akkai, would you like to go first? Or there might be a gap in... Akkai, can you hear? You start.
Shall I go?
Yes, please.
Okay, should I go ahead?
Please, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, currently what we're seeing in the last few years is that the present BJP government has really kind of tried to take over the trans rights debate. We saw with the enactment of the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act in 2019, that was one of the first moves. I mean, it seems ostensibly like a progressive legislation, the fact that we're having a legislation for legal gender recognition. And it was, though the versions of the bill were there from 2014 onwards, and initially introduced by private members and not by the BJP, suddenly in 2019, after Modi's second election win, there's been a sudden urgency to introduce this.
Exactly. Yes.
And with this, to kind of really shape or locate trans issues within the Hindutva kind of framework.
Yes.
And we see that with a kind of co-opting of a few trans voices into the far right. And we saw this right after the 2019 Act was brought into force with Yogi Adityanath. He's the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh and a very, very far right Hindutva, background of politics. There has been a re-emergence of the Kinnar Gharana, which is like trans activists, really taking the Hindutva right-wing kind of position and positioning themselves and trying to shape the movement as being aligned to Hindutva beliefs. And these are Many of them are also placed by the government in the National Transgender Persons Council. This is a body set up under the Act to address issues of transgender rights discrimination, and these are the people politically appointed by the government. This is also an area of challenge. So yeah, these are the ways in which the trans rights movement is in some ways trying to be co-opted by the Hindutva campaign, and these are really the concerns. Because an argument is made that, yes, this government is going to, this is seen as a voting bank, this is seen as a vote bank, but other issues of, reservation and, equal opportunity in government employment, housing, criminalization, all these issues are not addressed. But but it is again within a framework of rights. So, as we discussed in some of the earlier discussions in the Bergen exchanges, the language of rights is used as a way of taking away rights. And we see that being done within the larger kind of Hindu majoritarian kind of religious framework. And so where does that leave religious minorities? This is within a Brahminical framework. So where does it leave Dalit Adivasi trans communities and those issues of discrimination? So all of these are marginalized, and that really is a matter of serious concern.
And it's being done while the entire discourse of minoritization hinges on racialization, the Hindu nationalist racialization of these bodies, but it also becomes a way of sort of managing their international image by saying, look, we're not anti-trans, for example, which is also extremely dangerous, insidious, and problematic. Yes. Akkai, would you like to respond?
I request you to repeat the question, please.
Yes, of course. In what ways does the present Hindu nationalist state and its institutions fail to halt prevailing, dominant, binary, heteronormative morality, gender moralities, politics, norms, and practices to enforce violence, political violence, ideological, legal violence on trans persons and communities, and continue with the intent to criminalize such individuals and groups?
Yeah. I think, first of all, we are all bound with the constitution morality. Yeah. But here what happens, constitution morality has been totally failed to understand by the legislators. Now everyone is wanting to practice their caste morality, wanting to practice the religious morality, wanting to practice their majoritarianism morality. So this is really distracting to communities like us, which includes Dalits, the religious minorities, the caste minorities, the sex workers, and many other sections of our society. The recent past of the last 8 to 10 years that we have seen how is India shining at the international level, from the demonetization process to the Citizenship Amendment Act to the Anti-Conversion Bill, and to be the Farmers Act to the Women's Reservation Bill, to many other aspects of it. Nothing was discussed and debated in the parliament. And this discussion, if it is not going to happen in our legislative system, so then what is next about the democracy that we are speaking about? So here the question is very simple. I think the concept of the so-called majoritarianism and the so-called minuscule/minority, that we are part of the country, and we are also known for our caste-based discrimination, gender-based discrimination, sexuality-based discrimination that's going on. I think for this only thing is that the communities like us, we need to be together to fight against all forms of exclusion. I think there is no space for us to discuss about social inclusivity. There is a space for social exclusion by the current ruling governance, where they're not respecting people's voice, not respecting people's education. Recently, the Bilkis Banu's case, which has happened, the Gujarat government has sanctioned of releasing 11 people who were indulged in rape. And that shows the notion of the state. And just forget about the Supreme Court verdicts. I think there are very few legislators, very few bureaucrats, very few stakeholders, very few family members, very few advocates like Jayna who speaks about our issue. In across sections, I think we as community voices, especially the working class voices, needs to be heard in across platform. I think that's our activism is going to be focused for the couple of decades from here. Yeah.
Thank you. Brilliantly said. And also the alliance you speak of, which you demonstrate over and over again, including your recent showing up so strongly to protest the release of these rapists. Not only release, but their adulation by BJP functionaries. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Let's see. Susan, if I may. I saw your film a long time ago in my adopted place. Home is a contested word at times, so place of San Francisco, and again yesterday. And thank you for your prolific work. Represents some of the best the city can be, I believe. At the crossroads of Taylor, what role can a memory archive of dissidents, of revolutionary meaning, that is endangered and frail and partial and fragmented but struggling for freedom, play in strengthening resistance to that which is carceral, to that which is racialized and criminalizing and classed forms of power that continues to control bodies and invade into, I feel, deeper and deeper the tenderloin in ways that are symbolic, idiomatic, and that functions to securitize. So from especially Black trans lives, for example, in the present. So from then, having mapped and stayed with this movement and communities and understood its history, what are the changes? What is hopeful? What is disturbing?
Big questions.
Big questions, yes.
Well, to answer the big questions, the way, kind of in the spirit of the presentation I gave today, to think in a very concrete, situated way about it. Part of the work that I'm trying to do in being, I think of myself as like one of the stewards or caretakers of the Compton's story, to tell it and see what people do with it, is doing the work of connecting the historical research that I've done with what can be done in the present and how do we address the needs that actually exist at that location today. And rather than thinking of myself as a person who has an answer because I know a story, I want to tell the story and see what work the story does, and then to try to be someone who facilitates connections between different constituencies who all have a stake in what happens at that location. And I, in a longer version of the talk that I gave today, I said, what would it mean and what would it take to actually get Geo Group out of the building, to decarcerate the facility, to actually turn it into low-income housing? What would it be like to reopen the cafeteria as a job training program for people who are exiting incarceration and need to have different life skills? Could it become a site of historical interpretation and memory that commemorates what's happened there? How could we use attention to the story of the riot as a way of better meeting the needs that people in the neighborhood have now? And like I said, I don't want to be the person who has an answer. I want to ask the questions. But then like I said, try to connect different groups. It's like I'm working right now with a group of architects and city planners and urban historians who are doing a detailed sort of site history of the building, looking at its architectural plans and trying to use their study of the physical location as a way to then get funding to do an architectural design competition that could be part of physically reimagining what the building could be. But we're also working with the local indigenous community, the Ramaytush band of the Ohlone people. Well, what does it mean to even think about rebuilding something that has been built on appropriated land? What would it mean to unbuild something there? To unsettle that place. We're working with prison abolitionists and anti-police activists. We're working with people in cultural heritage and tourism. There's another group of people who are working on designating the building. The city of San Francisco just recently passed an ordinance making it a recognized city landmark, but we're working to have it listed on the National Register of Historic Places, because once it's listed on those places, then there's government funding that becomes available for cultural heritage and preservation work. Working with different arts groups to do artivist interventions in public space around the building. And that my big takeaway from all of that is, it's like it might be that we could pull together millions of dollars. The building is currently valued at $35 million. But a combination of city funding or land trust or private donors to acquire the money to buy the building from Geo Group. But even if that's not possible, it's like what I think is honestly the most important thing is that in the attention to the story, in the attention to the land, in the kinds of social networking that happens around the locations, what we are actually doing is creating a new social arrangement. It's like there's a new sociality that is emerging between the activists. Regardless of what happens to the site, there's a different consciousness that's coming into being, a different set of social relations among the practitioners of activism around the site. And that in and of itself, I think, is something that mobilizes the memory and legacy of the event to create a kind of social change in the present, regardless of whether or not we can physically liberate the building. We're liberating ourselves in the process of attending to the struggle.
That is so beautiful to hear, and I think how then the event serves as sort of an imaginary for larger activism in the city, and the decorporatization, if we talk about attention to land in San Francisco and the Bay Area, my goodness, and decorporatization, not the chasing out of communities whose land it is, right? And also what is really powerful from what you just articulated is, what does community decision-making look like? Not where community shows up to participate, but where they are able to govern their decision-making, where actions take place with their consent. What would that look like? And I think this is something important to the survival of San Francisco, the one that we all show up to.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
So thank you. Yes. I now would like to ask Anzio Jacobs. Yes, am I pronouncing it correctly? Yep. Thank you. So, witness to the systematic disfigurements and displacements that are inherent to the post-colonial condition, post always in brackets. What methodologies, as I listened to you speak yesterday and today, this is a question that stayed with me, what methodologies are currently facilitative for you in your urgent work to voice these new scapes of dissent to colonial, racist, post- and neo-colonial forms of power? Because you sketch forms of power, you sketch the various interventions that are necessary, you sketch profound loss, you sketch projects of hope, and I just wonder if you would think with us for a moment methodologically and talk to us about that.
I think I said early on in my presentation that I'm not an academic. Methodology is such a scary word for me because I never know exactly what we mean by methodology. Pathways and routes may be a bit easier, right?
Yes.
There's an interesting link that I keep going back to, which is this recent student movement. I was struck when thinking about kind of the ways that we can find pathways and routes to think about what kind of modern forms of archive are emerging, and this often through very young people. The emergent archives that I'd want to mention is like the use of the Arab Spring in informing what happened in Fees Must Fall in South Africa. Then when Fees Must Fall was happening, there were protests in Colombia, and students in Colombia were organizing around kind of university and access to universities, and then we connected with students in India at the same time. And these movements are speaking to one another, and as they are speaking to one another, they're reimagining these new methodologies, organizing. And I wonder what that organizing has the potential to do. In the South African context, I suppose we tried and perhaps failed in building flat structures for organizing, thinking that if we could put everybody kind of with the same voice, with the same ability to speak into space, that we would be doing justice to the space that we were creating. That did not work. We thought through what it would look like to decolonize the spaces that we're in, and so in that decolonization, we thought, let's rename buildings, let's start to insert ourselves into the spaces that we are problematizing. And they did that, and at Wits University where I studied, unfortunately we renamed all of the building to names of black men. I was part of the renaming, so I cannot recuse myself. But we need to use our imaginations a little bit more. I think if you're looking for methodology, we've got to use methodologies that enable us to try and fail and try again. And in doing so, perhaps we can recover new ways of engaging one another so that we can engage our history into a future. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does in some way.
I don't think an answer is what I was expecting. I think just conversations that we begin, fragments, partial, always frail, but nonetheless attempted, over and over. So yes, we have a little more than 15 minutes, so maybe a very brief question and 1-minute responses, and then maybe we can take some questions from people who've gathered here. So for transnational organizing, the notion of ally takes on a different meaning, right? It's complicated in various ways. The notion of one's own changes and remorphs, right? In attempting such organizing, which is part of all of your work, and I'm very sorry that we lost Akkai to poor internet connection because there's heavy rain where Akkai is in India right now. So in transnational organizing, what would you ask allies to never forget and always remember? One thought, small comment, anything? Jayna, would you? Okay. Go with Susan. Would you like to start?
Well, I would just say I really try to be aware of the kinds of privilege that I walk with, as well as the ways that I get minoritized. And as a white person who's English speaking from the US and North America and thinking about gender and sexuality in a particular way, that I really think it behooves me not to ask my allies to pay attention to certain things so much as it behooves me to shut up and listen and work to decenter the ways that I have privilege so that the ways that I am oppressed can find better allies with people elsewhere.
I shared this yesterday. The future is plural and intersectional. And so in a world where power is the preserve of a few, if we can begin to recognize that that is the case, perhaps we can start to do the work of unpacking it. I think that power, as we heard in your presentation, can be quite pervasive. And in fact, power works best when it can hide itself. And so asking the other question consistently and ensuring that even as we try and answer, we ask ourselves that question. Right, we are the people that are writing these histories. We are the people that are building these repositories, and we will be the people that will leave a history behind that will be that of future generations to consume.
Thank you. I think as allies, what we try and do is to listen to the stories and try and put those stories first, and also I think as allies try and learn, because for me and for others at the Center for Law and Policy Research, where we've worked on gender, I think being part of the women's movement, I think our work on queer rights and trans rights has actually helped us understand gender better, and look at the context of other forms of discrimination and see how those connections can be made. And perhaps that's what we can do best as allies.
I think in not asking of allies, but asking of yourselves, that is perhaps the most daunting, vulnerable and urgent ask to put forward. So thank you for that. We have 15 minutes for questions. So if people would, how should we do this? Ask people to come to the mic? And if you have any that are via too. Okay, so while you are, if you have questions, if you're coming to the mic, would you like to take one of these questions, please?
Yes, there's a question from Catherine Wires. The legal decisions in the past 8 years have separated out Indian transgender identities from male identities and female identities. What impact has this separation had on access to public services, such as public services mediated through Aadhaar? I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Thanks.
Should we maybe take a couple more questions and then respond in the interest of time? Perfect, please.
Hi, sorry for reading. I just sometimes find it difficult to order my thoughts. Something that struck me about the Screaming Queens documentary yesterday, where, for those of you who weren't there, featured essentially sort of literal get-out-of-jail-free cards, exemptions from criminality on the basis of being treated for quote-unquote transsexualism. So something that struck me was the tensions between, on the one hand, genuinely problematic legal solutions that nevertheless give trans and gender non-conforming people a means of accessing things like education and employment, and on the other hand, the frustration at the way in which trans people are continually categorized as transgender rather than, in the case of the documentary, women, and thus are othered in the very process of being given basic rights. And which resonates quite strongly with some of the things we've been hearing this morning about halfway houses and carceral spaces, and the way in which trans and gender non-conforming people in India are being legally identified in ways that don't necessarily align with their sense of self. So I was wondering if the panelists might expand on those tensions in relation to their own research and experiences. Thank you.
Hi, my question is again for the Indian context. So there has been a judgment, actually order very recently from the Supreme Court of India. It was uploaded last Sunday only. And the key takeaway is that the next Chief Justice of India, who would be 9th of November 2022 this year, has said in an unconnected matter, and he has been quoted often now, that queer relationships and unmarried partnerships are as real as traditional families and deserve equal protection under law and benefits under the social welfare scheme. So, would you think this is an appropriate time to organize social movements in a manner that the moment, he's there, he's the master of roster in November, that we can get a progressive judgment again after his, last Nalsa and Navdeep Singh feat? Thank you.
Maybe start from, would you like to comment on any of them?
No, not immediately.
Okay. Susan?
Maybe just a brief response to the question that the second question, which to boil it down, it's like, what do I think about naming and identifying people as trans or giving people from minority sexuality, gender status as a particular designation? I think you're right to point out that it's a two-edged sword, two sides of the coin, that on the one hand, there's recognition, and recognition often is a means of accessing social services, but it's done in a way that minoritizes, excludes, I think limits full citizenship and recognition of personhood. I think of identity categorization often functions as another form of carceral power. It's a way of, like, in some ways, incarcerating you in a prison of flesh that is given a name, and that is a tactic of state power over our bodies. I would rather be unrecognizable or imperceptible than, like, seen as a tactic of governance. I don't think state-based solutions are where any of us are going to win our freedom, and so I don't think elaborating a more refined state apparatus that better recognizes me somehow and the particularities of my own existence is something that necessarily serves my own life goals. And I would really rather focus on other strategies for living and surviving and imagining futures, rather than pursuing any kind of state-based recognition strategy.
It's also, what you highlight is so important, because I think sort of the truth and fixity that the state accords to identity, rather than identity as a political act, right? Just reinscribes its power.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Interestingly, South Africa has recently passed laws that you can have your gender identity recognized, but it has come with so many issues because now with this recognition, you've got to battle a series of systems that doesn't recognize you. And so on the one hand, as you're saying, it's very useful to have a category that the state can see you with, but it comes with a plethora of problems that are perhaps even greater than just the recognition. Yep.
And of course, if I may make just one small comment, that the terrain of the law, it doesn't matter if it exists. There might be the best laws in the book, but unless we as a collective, as people living in a certain space or, across the world, make it our business to not live in certain ways, things don't change. Simply that. Laws don't change things. They can help us at best. States also, for anybody in the global south to put their faith in the state who's not dominant is so absurd given how it has been constructed, formed, etc. So, yeah, thank you so much. Very, very important for us to remember.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to respond to some of the questions, and also ties in with what you said, that there is now a requirement of identity, getting an identity card under the new Transgender Persons Act. And while you can, and there are concerns with medicalization, because you can get a card as a transgender person, but if you want a male or female identity, you have to prove medical certification. And in many of the welfare schemes, and especially in reservations in public employment, the generally accepted criteria is that there is reservation given to trans women. So, you asked the question that what about trans men? And that is you know, in the welfare schemes, that is not seen as a transgender category. You know, it's because the general belief with the government schemes is that, you know, you're male to female, and you know, those are the accepted categories. And in fact, there has been a recent judgment of the Madras High Court where, you know, there was for the recruitment of police constables, you know, there were a certain number of posts for women police constables and male police constables, and the reservations for trans persons was under the category of women police constables. And so the question was raised that what if it's a person who identifies as a trans man, then that candidate will not get the reservation as a transgender person. So those, certainly I think you raised the right question, but it's also these hurdles with identities, and you know, the questions raised by the government often is that, oh, you need, you know, when the demand is made that why does someone need an identity card? And so the question is, oh, but how do we know that it's a genuine person? You know, and the question of fraud, which we were just discussing, oh, you may just be faking it to get the benefit. You know, you may be impersonating. You know, we saw the movie yesterday that, oh, people are going to be impersonating. And the same debates came up a few years ago with the Disabilities Rights Act. So in India, we also have a disability legislation where a person with disability has to get a disability card. And the same allegations are made, which is medicalized, that what if you are not, you know, really a person with disability and just impersonating someone to get a certain benefit. And so these are really the hurdles with any form of government identification, which are linked to benefits, because the state says, well, you need identification because what if someone else takes the benefit? So, you know, those are the real hurdles. And how do we get out of those structures? And lastly, to, you know, Bhavya's question about queer relationships, and you know, Justice Chandrachud is going to be the next Chief Justice in 2 months, and there's a lot of excitement because he gave, you know, some of the big decisions and is quite vocal about his views. But I don't know, I would be a little cautious, because I think that there's too much excitement and we, you know, jump into things. But I think, you know, the ground for non-traditional relationships to be more accepted, I think on the ground we need to do a lot more work. I know there are petitions for same-sex marriage equality filed in the courts, and they're pending, but I think, I mean, we need to see more non-traditional relationships in India, you know, openly. Those are tough, but how do we build the ground for that? You may get a Supreme Court decision, but there may be a backlash against it, so I'm not sure, but I would be a little cautious, even if the new Chief Justice comes. I mean, he's not going to be deciding alone, right? There are going to be other judges with him, and I'm not too sure, yeah.
Absolutely, and just two things I wanted to mention from this. One is supporting the right to marry for everybody who desires it. In India, I'm speaking to India, this is not limited to India, but the institution of marriage itself, I think we have a little bit of work to do there. I think that also the urban bias is not the right term, but proving identity in a rural context in India, it can be a daunting process for anyone who is marginalized on the basis of class or religion or caste, etc., but particularly for someone who is identified as trans man or woman, or trans, or however they choose to identify, for them to be able to, because every encounter with the law is also a potential for violence. Right? And there to show up with that level of vulnerability, without resources, without even understanding sometimes what is expected of them, is absolutely terrifying as a prospect. We're seeing that also in Assam with the citizenship issue, where people of Bangla Muslim descent who are citizens are now being, there's a way in which they are being, the attempt is to render them stateless. And within that community, of course, all manner of vulnerabilities, but the very few cases of people identified as trans men or women that we have seen is absolutely horrific.
Because you don't have documentation required to get further documentation.
That's right. And if you go to get it, that's the first moment or in that step of giving yourself to violence, forms of persecution, forms of corruption, etc. Exactly, yes. I don't want my voice to be the last thing on this panel, so maybe 1 minute if people want to have concluding thoughts on any of the conversation or something you felt you left out, you'd like to add?
Mine was just around this naming and designating and how it's an issue when it comes to aid. The Christian right in the South African context at this point in time uses the naming that we use to explain to communities who we are against us. So you could almost hear word for word what we present in our communities as we are teaching people about our identities, repeated back to us in the negative connotations. This is linked to the aid that is in our context. And what is interesting to me is that in rural contexts, there's a grappling with naming and identifying and needs. So basic access to things like water, basic access to services are put in straight contention with the ability to identify oneself within a system that is perpetuated in most instances by the use of aid. And you know, then you start seeing the disasters that come with the presence of aid.
Thank you. None?
No, fine. I'm good.
May we put in a request for a new film?
Sure.
Okay. Yes.
No, I'm good.
Okay. Thank you so much for your profound and prolific, long-standing work, and hope we will be together again, all of us, soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the presenters and Angana for also leading this very rich and wonderful conversation. I think my mic is still off? Yeah. Oh, there we are. So thank you to all of the speakers and to Angana for leading this wonderful and rich conversation and for helping us to think around how we can tell queer stories, contest queer stories, and reclaim them. Now I see some people are already getting ready for lunch. It will give all of us the time to take in some of the impressions and thoughts that we've gotten so far today. The lunch will last until 1 o'clock, and then we will continue the program. So I look forward to seeing everyone back here then. Thank you so much.